Mr. Secretary General, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to today's very special event. My name is Michael Weisberg, the Interim Director of Perry Worldhouse, and I'm really delighted to introduce today's event and to welcome all of you here to Perry Worldhouse. Acute food insecurity and cholera outbreaks in parts of Africa, security-related crises in Sudan, Yemen, and Afghanistan, extreme weather in Bolivia and Mongolia. These are just a few examples of complex and protracted humanitarian emergencies that do not receive sufficient funding or attention from the international community, leading to prolonged hardship and deteriorating conditions for affected populations. These are examples of forgotten crises. And at a time when the intensity and frequency of compounding disasters and crises rises, the work of humanitarian organizations becomes increasingly complex. So despite critical efforts, the funding gap for forgotten crises widens and international support steadily dwindles, jeopardizing the essential delivery of assistance and leaving communities struggling in silence. What innovative approaches could ensure sustained support for these forgotten crises and break this cycle of neglect? Can we bridge the funding gap and empower local communities to build resilience? To help us answer these questions and many more, we have today a very special guest, the head of an organization that comes into everybody's mind when we think about taking humanitarian action. Jagan Chapagan is the Chief Executive Officer and Secretary General of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent. It's based in Geneva, Switzerland. He brings decades of experience in building and leading inclusive teams and forging partnerships to address global challenges. An engineer by training, he began his humanitarian journey as a youth volunteer with the Nepal Red Cross and has gone on to lead effective and principled humanitarian responses across the world. Prior to being appointed as a Secretary General, he served as Undersecretary General for Programs and Operations at the IFRC. And he was also previously Chief of Staff and Regional Director for Asia Pacific, where he provided leadership during large-scale humanitarian crises and helped to build resilient communities. This year, the Secretary General is the Wolk Visiting Fellow at Perry Worldhouse. And discussing with him today is my partner in running Perry Worldhouse, Marie Harf. She's our Executive Director. Marie comes to Penn from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, where she served as the Executive Director of External Relations. And previously, she worked as a Senior Advisor and Deputy Spokesperson for Secretary John Kerry at the U.S. State Department and as the Foreign Policy Director on Barack Obama's 2012 re-election campaign. She's been involved in many other things over her many years in Washington, including as a Middle East analyst and spokesperson at the CIA. And since 2017, Marie's been an on-air commentator for Fox News. Please help me in welcoming them to the stage.
Thank you so much. Don't worry, I'm not going to read it. It's just my cheat sheet. No, first of all, thank you so much for having me here, and thank you for joining this conversation. And I understand there are many people also joining online virtually, so I also want to recognize their presence. I'm also touched to see that by attending this session, it also shows that you really care. You really care about the situation in the world, which are just generally not on the news. But of course, the human suffering is human suffering, whether they are on the news or not. Before I start, I want to share with you a small story, or a small event that actually happened. As you know, as IFRC, we have always been working on all sorts of crises, whether they make in the news or not. And this has been our history for more than 100 years. But the one incident happened a few years ago when I was visiting Norway. I had just started, I was in the job already 2 years, and we are going through COVID-19. And once the international armed conflict in Ukraine started, few months after that, I was in Oslo, in Norway. And with one of the member of parliament, we were engaging with a group of students. They were 12, 13 years old students, 30, 40 of them. And we were talking about the global issues and the humanitarian issues around the world. And among those students, the one student, he raised his hand and he asked me a question. And he was the only black boy in that room. And he asked me a question basically saying that why is it that when people are impacted by the large crisis, they get all the attention and a lot of support. But when people are affected by small crises, which do not get attention, they don't get any support and they don't get any attention. Why is it so? And that 13-year-old boy shook my conscience. I could not answer that question directly. And as a leader of one of the largest humanitarian organizations, which is a community-based, which is present in 191 countries, which has more than 16.5 million volunteers around the world, and I had difficulty answering that question. And that incident made me think that we have to do more as an organization, and I have to do more personally as a leader of that organization to put a spotlight on the crises which are not on the news, not on the 24-hour cycle news, or now increasingly in the social media or in the mainstream media. And that's why whenever I get the opportunity like this one, and thank you Perry World House for creating this opportunity for me to talk about it. I don't think what I'm going to share is something which you don't know already. So please don't expect that I will be saying something you didn't know or you haven't heard about it. So I sort of like to give you the warning. But probably reinforcing some of the issues that you already know. But it's important sometimes to repeat the issues again and again and again before people start taking the issue seriously and it gets to the policy-making level, the decision-making level. That's why I'm taking this time. Now, why this issue becomes even more important today? If you look at the world we are dealing with now, of course, it's very much the political discourse now, the media discussion is very much around the crisis in Gaza. And we can see the heartbreaking scene coming every day. And there are, of course, a lot of challenges to deliver the humanitarian assistance, including for my organization. And we have already lost more than 18 staff and volunteers in that conflict. And also some of the hospitals can no longer operate. I mean, that's really a heartbreaking scenario we have. Also, there are a few other conflicts, like the international armed conflict in Ukraine. These are, of course, the situation which do get a lot of attention. And while delivering assistance is very difficult, of course, they do grab a lot of attention in the political circle, in humanitarian circle, and of course, in media. While, of course, we do our best to respond to those crises, there are also multiple other situations which are impacted by the context we see in the world. The context where we have multiple social crises, where we have rising inequality, as we see, in many parts of the world, very uneven employment opportunities, particularly for the young people. There are sense of exclusion in different parts of the world, the exclusion in different sense and forms, political, economic, the opportunities, but also exclusion in various shape and forms. And exclusion is the sense of feeling excluded creates a sense of hopelessness. And that sort of creates a huge tension in a society. So the exclusion is a major issue we see around the world. And of course, as you saw during the COVID-19, the exclusion from the point of view of the health perspective. When the COVID-19 vaccine came, of course, there was a global solidarity until the vaccine came. the minute the vaccine came, unfortunately, some of the solidarity disappeared. And the countries who had the means started hoarding the vaccines. And it was also heartbreaking to know that a situation like COVID-19, by vaccinating your people, you are not protecting the world because the virus transmits. You cannot control the virus through the immigration control or something like that. And the countries with the incredible ability to understand this suddenly forgot that global solidarity. And it took much longer to control the virus than it could have been if we were not that selfish. So there are many senses of exclusion that happens around the world. So it creates a societal tension. Of course, there is also a massive progress on the technological side we see around the world, which is amazing. And of course, now the artificial intelligence, everybody talks about it. But there are multiple opportunities for technological advances happening. But it's extremely unequal. During the COVID-19, we actually identified that the 80 of our members did not have a minimum digital connectivity to be able to be part of the world. And that digital divide is growing very, very fast. That means the people who do not have access to digital capacity are excluded more and more from the discussion that happens around the world. And it creates a different form of exclusion. And it creates a different class of people who have access to and who do not have access to. And this is, while the technological advance is amazing, if we don't take into consideration that the huge population in the world still do not have access. And as you know, a lot of now, the assessment we do, the data we collect, is also automatized. The algorithms are created. Then what happens is these tools capture the data from people who actually use those tools, not the data from people who don't use those tools. So a lot of time the data we use is completely skewed from the people who have access to, and it doesn't capture the full reality of what happens around the world. Then of course the economic progress the world has made and the economic disparity that exists in the world. And COVID-19 sort of brought some of that into open. And I think again that sense of, some of the studies done by Oxfam, you will see that in number of countries, 98% of the resources is controlled by 2% of the population, and remaining 98% of the population have access to only 2% of the resources. And this sense of inequality and disparity and the gap, again, creates a sense of exclusion. Of course, the mega trends now that exist globally, the environmental, the climate change, also there are other trends of urbanizations, the migration, the movement of the people, the number of people they are moving around the world. Every year the data comes, there are more and more people moving around the world. And I think clearly the world system is unable to capture this phenomenon now. But if we look at the history, we all moved. Each of you, I'm sure, have moved, or your parents and grandparents have moved. So the human history has been underpinned by the mobility. And suddenly now, with all the capacities we have in the world, we are unable to address that mobility of people that happens in the world, and it becomes a political and sometimes, frankly, dehumanization of the people who are just looking for opportunities. And sometimes they are just looking to save their families from the crisis they have to deal with. And of course, the massive demographic shifts that's happening. And if you look at the sort of the developed world, the population, the older population is much bigger than the smaller, younger population who will have to somehow support the system. But then if you go to Africa and part of Asia, it's reverse, where you have a huge younger population who are looking for opportunities, and those opportunities do not exist. And it, again, creates a societal tension and a sense of exclusion. And finally, political. I think if we look at the world today and the many crises we are dealing with, there is an inability of the global political systems to find a political solution. So that means the new crises keep on coming before the solution have been found to a previous crisis. Now, combination of this, the social, technological, economical, political, and environmental and other mega crises means that the global humanitarian system is no longer able to cope with the workload it's put on the humanitarian system. Now, because the political system is unable to address some of these issues, somehow these issues become the humanitarian responsibility, and the humanitarian system was not designed to deal with primarily the political problem. And that's basically where the situation is. And in all this situation, as the crises keep on growing, the resources are not growing at the same pace, meaning that simply there's not enough resources available in the world to help the people who need help. Now, what happens is, if the media attention, the political attention is on some of the crises, the resources tends to go to those crises, naturally. Because that's where the attention is. And that's where also the decision maker feel the pressure from the media and the public that, no, you need to put those resources in those crises. And of course, rightly so. Those crises need the attention. But then what happens is the multiple other crises, the suffering of the people is exactly the same, but do not get the attention. And that's basically where the situation is. And I think Michael, in introduction, mentioned a number of crises from around the world. I was just in Zambia a few weeks ago. The country had gone through a massive cholera crisis. Did any of you hear about that? Most likely no, because it was not on the news. They had to turn their national stadium into a cholera treatment center. And it's a completely preventable and treatable disease, killed hundreds of people, and thousands of people have to go through that suffering. And I tell colleagues that the scene I saw there in the stadium, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of beds, people with the cholera come there. And these are the beds, the beds for cholera patients have a hole there. And below is a big bucket. And when you see that scene, hundreds and hundreds of those things, I still cannot get that scene out of my head. And it created zero attention. And in Malawi, in Mozambique, in DRC Congo, in Zimbabwe, this crisis is there. And if you look from multiple crises around the world, Central African Republic, Somalia, Sudan right now, it's a massive conflict going on there, a pretty brutal conflict. And it's also impacting a lot of our colleagues there in Sudan. Actually, some of my senior staff who come from Sudan, their houses have been taken. Doesn't make it to the news. 2 years ago, Afghanistan was the front line. It doesn't get mentioned. Is the crisis over? Absolutely not. It's gotten worse. Syria, Yemen, Libya, Myanmar. And of course, when you come to the region here, the crisis that has hit Honduras, none of them are on the news right now. Now, some of these crises have a certain characteristics. Of course, a lot of time, if we talk about Somalia, Afghanistan, these have a protracted nature of the crisis. There is, of course, not much of media attention and the political attention. But these are all underlined by a massive underfunding because they don't get the attention. And there is a prolonged hardship and over a period of time, the further deterioration of the human conditions and a hopelessness, particularly with the younger population, because when they have to live in that environment, they have a sense of hopelessness, that there's no future tomorrow, there's no day after tomorrow. And there is also, in many places, there is also a historical and systemic biases. You know, in many countries, there is, of course, the colonial legacies. There is also a racialized perception of human suffering and worthiness of aid. There is a racialized differences of human suffering, that some people's suffering is seen as more important than other people's suffering. And unfortunately, it exists. It shouldn't, but it does. And one of the key characteristics of the Forgotten Crisis is that racialized differences. And I think in 2024 and beyond, we must be able to overcome that if we have that collective commitment on that. So I think there are multiple examples. I think I want to leave time for the discussion, so I will not get into the details of those issues now. And from my organization as the IFRC, because we are a very community-based organization, present in almost every country in the world, with the volunteers, 16.5 million volunteers, 650,000 staffs. What we are trying to do with our ability and capacity is to put a spotlight on this crisis and also have instrument to do our best to support this crisis. We do have what we call a disaster response emergency fund that's dedicated to support such crises. Last year, we supported around 160 such crises around the world. And we are trying to reinforce that fund now. And there are also multiple other situations. And tomorrow we are going to have a program, we are calling it the Online Summit, together with the USAID, where we would like to spotlight, again, a forgotten crisis, that's a heat waves. Like in the United States, here, the heat waves kills more people than all the other climate-induced disasters every year. That's a fact. But does the heat waves get talked about? Probably 2-3 days when it's too hot. Beyond that, it doesn't get talked about. But that's the biggest killer here in the United States when you talk about the climate-induced disasters. So we are trying to put a spotlight on some of those issues and do our best, of course, to contribute. And from IFRC's point of view, our approach has been, of course, whenever there is a crisis, we respond to the crisis. And this has been our more than 100 years of history. We're generally good at that, and we do that. But we also want to put increasing focus on trying to reducing the fragility. Constantly responding to fragility is just not sustainable, the resources are not there, and the human suffering is more and more. So can we do to actually preventing the fragility from happening in the first place? And there are multiple things through anticipatory action, by preparedness and investing on prevention, you can actually, in some places, prevent the fragility, or at least you can reduce the impact on human being and on the planet. And that's where we are putting a bigger emphasis. At the same time, the humanitarian work should not be seen just as a charity. We got to do it right. Looking into the people's, not only the people's needs, but also the people's aspirations. And this should just not be about meeting the basic needs, but it's about creating that hope. So the people feel that there is tomorrow, there is day after tomorrow. And that's where it's extremely important that we do the right thing, but we also must do the right thing in a right way, with the human dignity and respect, and have the tools that promotes the human dignity and that promotes the human respect. And that's where our approach is. We respond to fragility whenever there is a crisis, but we want to put more emphasis on reducing the fragility and minimize the impact, but also do a much better job doing these things in a right way, in a more accountable way. And I think that's where I think we all need to work together. Now, of course, I tried to paint the picture that may sound a bit bleak, and unfortunately, in many places it is. But I'm also personally a very optimistic person and a very hopeful person. And I do believe that all is not lost. If we have people like yourself and thousands and millions of people around the world who have that optimism and the commitment that together, if we commit, we can make a difference as human beings, as a fellow human being, we can make a difference. And if we join those forces, like the organization I lead, and the many, many hundreds and thousands of organizations, and millions of people like yourself, if we join forces, we can make a difference. And we can bring about the change. And the change doesn't happen at once. You know, it's a brick by brick. And if we can build a brick here and a brick there, and if we can build those thousands and millions of bricks, I believe that we can make a difference. And I'm one of those who believe that the future comes from the action we take today. There's no future there somewhere. It doesn't exist. The future comes on the basis of what action we are taking today. Our action today shapes the future. And I think we need to bring this optimism and hope in everybody. And if we act with that optimism and hope, I believe that we can turn around today's gloom and doom. This is my personal belief and my personal commitment. And I would really like to invite all of you and all of us that let's act wherever we are, whatever job we are doing. There's no big or small job. Everything we do, everywhere we are, we can make a difference. Thank you for listening.
Hello. Hi, everyone. I'll give you a second to catch your breath. Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary General, for those, I think, very honest comments, but also ending on a bit of a little more hopeful note, because if we lost all hope, I don't know how any of us would continue in these jobs. So we're so grateful to have you here at Perry World House. I will start by asking a few questions, but I'd really love to hear questions from the audience. We also, if you're watching online, you can put a question in the chat, so I would love to get to you all very quickly as well. I want to actually start where you started, with your conversation with that young boy.
Yeah.
How would you answer him today if he asked that? And what lessons have you learned about the tactics that actually do make people care?
Yeah.
I mean, so much of what you talk about sounds like particularly media coverage. How do you get reporters to cover these things? How do you, especially when many journalists don't have overseas bureaus anymore, they're funding, they don't have reporters in many of these places. How do you get people to care about these places, and how much of that is really a media campaign? I think I think if you just talk, it will be on.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I think, I'm not so sure whether I can still convince that young boy who asked that question. But one thing which I could share with him is that optimism I said earlier, that things may not change with one action. And sometimes I think we look for that silver bullet, and that silver bullet will solve all the problem. And probably that one silver bullet doesn't exist. It will have to be a compilation of multiple actions happening in different parts of the world. Clearly, the media plays a huge role. And of course, increasingly, the social media plays a much bigger role these days. But also, how do we get this discussion at the community level, at the lowest local level? And how do we mobilize the power of young people, in particular? Of course, everybody needs to take part. And start changing those conversations. And of course, there is a lot that can be done top-down, at the policy level, at the central level. And as we are seeing that those mechanisms are not functioning as well as they used to in the past. So meaning that we got to change that pressure from the bottom up.
How do you do that? And how do you get, in this age of, we're overwhelmed with information, right? We almost have too much information. How do you do that?
Yeah. And I think that's where the approach we are taking with our volunteers in the communities. So you promote that community organizations, and not just to do the charity work, because that's what used to be in the past, but to mobilize the community to push for some of the changes. And if we can, like just in the Red Cross, we have like 200,000 local branches around the world. And those 200,000 could start pushing for some of the changes. And this could start influencing few other. And if each of the 200,000 influence another 3 communities, that becomes 600,000 communities. So I think we need to have that both top-down approach where we continue to advocate for the policy level, the politicians to bring about the change, but at the same time, bring about that knowledge and that groundswell of community mobilization. And again, I'm not wanting to get into the politics because that's sort of not my job. But at the same time, if we look at it, when you have a well-informed communities, well-informed people, they will end up voting the right people in their parliament. And that's when the change starts coming. So, without getting into the politics, if we can mobilize hundreds of thousands of communities with the right message that the climate change is real, the migration, people are looking there for their safety and looking for opportunities. And the migration actually enriches the countries. And one of the best scientists in the world and the best economists have been the migrants. The Albert Einstein was a migrant. People forget about that. So how do we change this conversation? And if this happens, these communities will elect different type of leaders who care. And also the mobilized communities not only vote once, but they would also demand more accountability from their representatives. So again, this looks like a slightly longer term things and probably much hard to achieve. But of course, our focus is very much on the humanitarian side. And that's where we are engaging our youth much more. We are putting our volunteers much more on the forefront of what we are doing. And again, I'm very hopeful that we are able to bring about these small changes at a time, like that fund I talked about before, because we committed to expand that fund, and we managed to triple this fund in the last 3 years. And we also managed to get an innovative insurance window to that fund so that we can do more. I will probably give him a slightly more hopeful message than I gave 2 years ago.
I think that's the right trajectory. Yeah. You know, I think your faith in the power of elections is a welcome one that many of us are, I will speak for myself, nervous about in this year when more people are voting in the world than at any other time in human history. But you also, you're not a politician, but you're a diplomat. And you operate in many countries where they don't have elections. You have to negotiate with countries like North Korea, like the Taliban in Afghanistan. I'm so glad that you keep mentioning Afghanistan. A lot of Americans, I think, forgot about it the day we left. How do you work with country? You don't have the luxury of picking who you work with. How do you negotiate to get into some of these countries where they desperately need aid, where they don't have elections pressing their governments to can you say a little bit about that? Because I think it's a fascinating part of your job that people might not always think about.
No, it's a great question. As I mentioned, we, of course, present in almost every country in the world, at least in 191 countries. And of course, that gives us a foothold. So we are not only seen as, imposing out of Geneva, because we do have national organizations in almost every country in the world. And
you say almost every, where don't you have right now?
So one is Nicaragua, where we used to have a Red Cross, but last year they lost the membership, mainly because they did not maintain the standard that was needed to be a member. Eritrea is another one, and there are few small island developing states. So yeah, we are behind 2 or 3 countries. So I think there are 193 members of the United Nations. So these two, Eritrea and Nicaragua, are sort of the two ones. But once the conditions are right, we would like to have all of them on board. So the first thing is, coming back to the question, of course, we have that local presence. So we are not seen as imposing out of Geneva. The second thing is, and I think we were talking with your class the other day, the very important thing for us is our fundamental principles. Our fundamental principles are focused on humanity. Of course, we need to be aware of what happens around the world, the politics and everything, but our mandate is purely focused on humanity and humanitarian action. And And this humanitarian action, the principle of humanity, is actually supported through a neutral, impartial, and independent humanitarian action. And then we also have unity, voluntary service, and universality as additional principles. So our notion has been that, of course, our focus is humanitarian action and the principle of humanity, but we will do this without taking any sides, because our focus is on the person. And we will do it in an impartial manner. Impartiality means the needs comes first. The most urgent needs get the first priority. Doesn't matter, nationality, politics, religion, none of the things matters. The only thing that matters is the urgency of need. That's the impartiality. And the humanitarian action will have to be independent. Of course, we have to respect the law of the land. Wherever we operate, we respect the law of the land, but our action has to be independent. Nobody can tell us, do this or help this person or don't help that person. And if that happens, we cannot carry out our action.
I imagine that does happen.
Yeah, we do get pressure.
People who want you to not be neutral.
Yeah. Oh, it happens. And I think the last few years it has become increasingly difficult. Increasingly difficult that certain sides feel that you should not be neutral. And at times it's very hard. It's a very hard principle to follow, because of course you can see that maybe this side is wrong or that side is right. Of course, I'm also a human being, even if I'm a red crosser. And it's very hard to be neutral. But it's extremely important to maintain the principle of neutrality, because that's the only way we can be in those difficult places with the pure humanitarian interest. And we are, in many places, we are the only organization who can reach those places. And that's why it's very important that we preserve that. It doesn't mean that we don't care. It's not about being indifferent. It's about the choice, that we are making this choice so that we can reach those places where others cannot. And these days, because there are other organizations who can take sides, who can speak out, and we don't need to do everything ourselves. So that's basically the approach we take. And because of that principle of neutrality and focused on humanity, we are able to work in some of the, places which can be considered very difficult.
And dangerous. I mean, you mentioned you've had 18 local staff and volunteers in Gaza who've been killed since the start of the war.
Yeah, absolutely. But we have also lost people in Sudan. We have lost people, I think it was Central African Republic. On average, we lose 50 to 60 people a year working purely humanitarian work. And they lose life. But not only in conflict, but also in other situations like the COVID-19. It was February 18, 2020, I remember vividly, because that was the first volunteer death after I became the Secretary General.
And you became Secretary General 2 weeks earlier?
2 weeks earlier.
2 weeks earlier.
2 weeks earlier. The 1st of February 2020, I became the Secretary General. And 18th of February, the first volunteer died because of COVID-19. And you can imagine, we did not know much about COVID-19 that time. You remember those days, all the misinformation, disinformations, and everybody finding with solutions that how you can cure COVID-19. And 18th of February, a 38 years old ambulance driver volunteer died of COVID-19. Now, of course, as Red Cross, we are expected to support people to go to the hospital, the ambulance drivers, because a lot of us had the luxury to work from home. But you cannot drive a patient to ambulance from home. So the lot of the work done by our Red Cross volunteers could not be done from home. And imagine, as a Secretary General, what do you say? Stay at home? Because it's dangerous? Or tell them, go out and do your work. We have just lost a volunteer of COVID-19 because we don't know how to protect them properly. That was probably, as a new Secretary General, one of the hardest time in my life. But But again, we could not stay idle. So we had to, every morning we used to have a meeting with the colleagues, collecting the information and data we have and try to take the best possible decision we could take. And pray that the decision you have taken is the right one, because you don't have the full information. And incredible thing is, millions of volunteers want to go and volunteer. You could think that, oh, maybe we had a shortage of volunteers. No, we had increased volunteers, increased number of volunteers. So that means we had to rapidly scale up our duty of care, rapidly scale up PPEs to those volunteers, provide the basic trainings to them so they know how to protect themselves. And as you know, the supply chain got disrupted very rapidly. So getting the PPEs mobilized around the world was extremely difficult. The flights got stopped. But we used our network to the extent we could. And this is one of the proudest statistics I share all the time. During the COVID-19 time, on average, every day, we had 1 million volunteers volunteering outside. 1 million volunteers. You monetize that, how much that would be. You monetize that, because these volunteers don't get paid. 1 million every day. And that's sort of the proudest statistics I have. So the risk for volunteers is, of course, the war is the biggest risk, but there are also crises. Ebola, the same, very, very risky. So,
are we ready for the next pandemic? I mean, you very wisely mentioned cholera. There are all these other public health issues that don't rise to the level of pandemics. Ebola never did, but was quite severe and required a huge mobilization from the United States government, from the international community. Are we ready for this if it happens again? How are you trying to prepare for this, I should say?
I think in summary, we are better prepared than we were 4 years ago, but we are still not fully ready. Because very quickly we have forgotten some of the basic things that somehow got the COVID-19 spread so fast. The lack of public community health, including in developed countries. Public health infrastructure, the investment or lack of investment in the public infrastructure, the community surveillance systems in many parts of the world. And even after the pandemic treaty is still sort of lingering, the negotiation. So the seriousness that we saw 2-3 years ago is sort of dwindling down. So of course, it is still fresh. So like if I look at my organization, we are clearly better prepared than we were 4 years ago. But entirely as a whole, we are not ready. And it's sort of a bit upsetting that we so quickly we forgot as human beings. So from my organization point of view, that's where the emphasis on localization and getting that community preparedness, like one of the programs we have developed with the African Union in Africa, is to develop the community health workers, because they have a shortage of around 5 million community health workers in Africa at the community level. And we are working together with them to develop that. And actually, with the USAID Bureau of Global Health, we have been expanding the pandemic preparedness program in many parts of the world. We were actually working before COVID-19 on that. So, I mean, there are some work being done, but what worried me was the cholera in Zambia. When I went there, and what we found was, as you know, now there is a vaccine for cholera. And after all the COVID-19 and the vaccine drama we saw, I thought we would do better. So basically, the global vaccine stock available for cholera, half of them was allocated to Zambia when they faced that situation. That was completely inadequate. So only 1 dose was given because there was not enough. When you give 1 dose, of course, it's effective only for 6 months. When you give 2 doses, it's effective for 2 years. So that means they had to prioritize a certain area, mostly in capital, because that's where the biggest risk was. And then later on, of course, actually we sit in that committee to decide on the vaccine, together with WHO and others. And actually, collectively, it was decided that other half would also be sent to Zambia because it was needed to control that. I don't know whether I should say this, but globally, there is no stock of cholera vaccine anymore. And there is only 1 production facility in South Korea.
Why is that?
That's really the key question here. The most of the cholera outbreak happens in Africa. We have only one production facility in South Korea. They are doing their best to ramp up the production, and of course, the organization will be working with them. But why are we not investing that in Africa? Why can't we have one or two? And this is where the global development priorities are not always right. I'm sure there have been some right priorities, but clearly some of these things, through the discussion on the pandemic treaty, and at least we continue to advocate for, that the places where it is endemic or pandemic should be where? Closer. Many countries in Africa now have capacity to sort of manage some of these things. So, in short, we are better prepared, but not ready.
I'd like to go to the audience now. My colleague David has a microphone, so please raise your hand if you have a question, and he will come to you. David, do you want to start over here? Thank you.
Hi, Eileen Doherty-Sill. Thank you again for the wonderful visit to my class earlier this week. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how your organization coordinates with UN High Commission for Refugees, right? When I think of the two organizations, they're both so important and I think probably so overwhelmed. Where do you coordinate well? Where do you divide the labor? Could you just give us an idea about that?
Absolutely. As you know, we are part of what we call the Interagency Steering Committee. And that's where the major UN organizations, us in the Red Cross Red Crescent movement, and some of the large INGOs, we come together. And that's sort of the principal coordination mechanism. There are technical coordinating bodies, and of course, there are coordinating mechanism at the country level. So through that, of course, we coordinate very closely with UNHCR. Actually, just before coming here, I had a call with the World Food Program. We are discussing some of the ways where we can collaborate. And where some of the collaboration comes with the organization, UNHCR, but also with other organizations, is that local capacity to respond. We are probably one of the few organizations who have that community presence. So a lot of time, these large organizations are looking for partners who can work in the communities. For example, the UNHCR would not have those volunteer base or those people in the communities. So a lot of time, the UNHCR partners with our local Red Cross and their local branches to actually deliver the program. But of course, at the policy level, we also have a coordination. Similarly, on the issue of migration, we coordinate very closely with the International Organization for Migration. On the health with WHO, we have actually a global MOU, also with UNHCR. So there is a generally pretty good collaboration, but at the same time, as a Red Cross Red Crescent movement, we also maintain that independence and neutrality of our action. So good coordination, but ensuring that our action is not politicized. So that's the balance we maintain. Yeah.
Other questions? Yes. Lauren is monitoring the online chat, so thank you for folks online for putting questions in as well.
Thank you for this presentation. So much of humanitarian work is response. Is there any way to anticipate, if not preempt, human suffering, and what might preemptive action look like? Thank you.
This is one of your main goals, I know.
This is absolutely a great question. And I can tell you that we did not plant it. So.
Was that your staffer back in Geneva on there?
No, it's really a great question. Of course, when there is a human suffering happening, we have to respond. I mean, that's something absolutely we have to do. But increasingly, the anticipation part, particularly the climate-related disasters, can be anticipated more and more because the science and technology now has advanced so much that we can anticipate and we can take a preventive action. And in 2015, together with the German government, actually, we were the pioneer of the anticipated action globally. And now we are so pleased that it has become a global approach. Many other organizations have also taken this on board. Particularly on the climate-related disasters, we can anticipate, and this is beginning to get more and more share of our action moving forward. And we also have instruments to do that. But we also need to do much more around, in our jargon, we call building community resilience. By building community resilience, you actually prevent some of the disasters actually from happening, because the hazards doesn't have to be a disaster. The hazards could be there, but if you have, for example, the earthquake, 6 Richter scale earthquake in Los Angeles doesn't damage any house. The hazard is there, but it doesn't become a disaster because Los Angeles has built the houses and things like that in a way they can resist that. In my home country in Kathmandu, 6 Richter scale does a much bigger damage. And that's where the preventive action can be taken for many, many crises by building that resilience at the community level, at the infrastructure level. And of course, as a Red Cross, our niche and our focus is working at the community level. And we have some of the examples from the small island developing states. I was in Vanuatu in October to see some of the community work being done on the coastal areas. That actually prevents the disaster from happening. And we have some great examples. The Bangladesh has a very successful model of actually building resilience at the community level, particularly in the cyclone area in the coastal belt. So for us, we are putting increasing emphasis around the anticipatory action and building community resilience. And this could be done also in the health sector. There's so actually in health sector, you can do even more of the primary, through the primary healthcare system, building the resilience. So this is absolutely our commitment. We have increased our investment. We have strengthened our teams. But of course, we need almost everybody and the government, and particularly the private sector, and the MDBs, multilateral development banks, also to join forces to make a real difference.
Other questions? Yes, come right here in the back. Thank you, David.
Yeah, fantastic presentation. I've worked for 20 years with the UN, and it's really beautiful to hear somebody with your passion speak for it. So I have 2 questions, actually. One related to human emotions and one to artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you have spoken with a lot of passion, but probably you have found ever and again that nobody denies that humanitarian efforts are needed and that we need to do something for those who are in need, but that does not take them beyond the threshold from, I know it's right, but that doesn't mean that I need to get involved. So I'm wondering how you are moving beyond the, yes, okay, towards I'm gonna get involved. That's number 1. And number 2, to which extent are you and your organization already leveraging this latest hype of AI to go beyond what's currently being done towards the next level? Yeah. Thank you.
And on your first question, compared to some other organizations, in some sense we are a little different in the sense that as we have presence in every country, and if something happens in that country, the local Red Cross or Red Crescent are always expected and frankly demanded to respond. But generally, our focus, and I think I just mentioned the localization just in passing, our approach globally is always what we call as local as possible, as international as necessary. So our approach always is, can we respond this locally or domestically and nationally? Because also every time jumping is that it's also not always respectful. If there is a capacity to respond locally, why somebody needs to jump? The second thing also is, in the long run, it can also create unnecessary dependency while the local capacity can respond. So that's why our slogan is as local as possible, as international as necessary. And that's something we are really, really reinforcing. And I, again, give this example, in the COVID-19 response, we mobilized around 2.5 billion, and out of that 2.5 billion, only $500 million was international mobilization. 2 billion was domestic mobilization. And that's the direction we are moving to internationally. But nationally, generally, the Red Cross, Red Crescent group, they generally are expected to respond to. And they always try to do their best. The only situation where we could say no, and we also say no to money, by the way, if we believe that we cannot maintain our fundamental principles. If somebody comes and says, okay, we are giving this money, but you do this, and if that is not neutral, we will say thank you very much, because then that will compromise on our principles. And we do hard negotiation before we say no. On the issue of AI, and you are absolutely right that of course there is so much hype and everything happening around the world. And to be very honest, we are also trying to figure out that how best we can use it positively, on the positive sense. Of course, also when you look at AI, of course it starts from ChatGPT to all sorts of things developed now. So we are still in a learning phase, in the sense that how we can co-opt some of these things in the organization. And there are some of the things, like the ChatGPT are now, in the Microsoft, they have also advanced a lot, and we use a lot of Microsoft tools in our office work. So some of these things are happening, and we will try to more systematically incorporate some of that work. But to sort of say that as AI, this is what we are doing, we are not there yet. Because some of the AI that we need to use to do our work, the technology, some of them is still being developed, and it is still, and when it is available, it's too expensive. So this is sort of in the developing phase, I would say. But we are very conscious about, we have developed a global, what we call digitalization strategy, to sort of consciously look into it and adapt as sort of the technology evolves. Some of the things through the Microsoft we are already adopting, but I believe that it is, we are in a learning phase.
I think I'm going to give the last question, the director's prerogative, to Dr. Weisberg.
Thanks.
He comes with his own microphone.
I have my own microphone. Well, in some sense, it's a summary question. And you basically talked both about Forgotten Crises and also then just a few minutes ago about anticipatory action, both as kind of, things that you wish that policymakers would be considering. So I guess I'm just curious, like, since time, attention, money are the precious resources, and they're hard for that reason because they're not in front of people's minds, what are particular narratives, things that you say that you found have actually shifted people into thinking the way that you'd wish us to think, to put Forgotten Crises front of mind, to realize that anticipatory action's not responding to the, what you saw in the news, but it would save more lives? Are there techniques that you found?
What works?
Yeah, exactly.
What works? In a very
what narratives work?
Yeah, exactly.
Again, I think we haven't found a silver bullet. I think it looks like a grinding, non-stop work. You go to every meetings, you repeat it. You go to UN events, you repeat it. You repeat it in your bilateral discussion. But at the same time, and that's one of the reasons I think I have shared with some of you, I was very keen to accept the invitation from the Perry World House to be here. It's also learn from the academic institutions, the data analysis. So in some of our grinding negotiation, if we can back up those arguments with solid data and evidence, which comes from credible sources, I think we can be more effective. And I think we have to combine the diplomacy, the tools, and the evidence, and never stop. That's basically, I think the one thing I have learned is the one meeting, one event just doesn't work. Yeah.
The work is never over. And this is really the last question, I promise. For our students particularly, there are 2 or 3 places, Forgotten Crises, places where they should focus, should start thinking about studying, working in. What are those? What do you want people to leave thinking about today?
I mean, it might be sort of general answer, but I think if you start from the climate and look into its consequences, I think that's probably where the starting point is. The heat waves I mentioned already, the hunger crisis and the food insecurity we saw in parts of Africa, which keeps on coming every 2 to 3 years, and the climate impacting on water, polluting water, and then it creates the health situations. So for me, I think the climate could be your starting point, and look into its consequences and sort of try to focus on the particular topic where it resonates with you. That's basically where I think my advice would be. And sometimes I know in some places the climate still becomes a debate which unfortunately still exists. But the consequences of it cannot be debated because it's there out. It's out there. More cyclone, more heat waves, more hunger, more choleras. So, I mean, no one can debate that. So if you focus on that consequences and take it from there, I think that's, you will be doing a great service to bring the forgotten crisis into the spotlight and make a difference. You know, as I mentioned earlier, it's a brick by brick thing. So build a brick here, brick there, and suddenly we will have built a house.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.